Good morning. My name is Theresa Quintanilla. I graduated from the business school in 1984 and have spent the last 40 years in Houston. And it's a real pleasure to be back here at reunion and introducing Gernot Wagner for his presentation on climate. I can find the name of the org. Knew I would do this. He is a climate economist at Columbia Business School, and his research, writing, and teaching focus on climate risks and climate policy. He writes a monthly column for Project Syndicate and has written 5 books, most recently, Geoengineering, The Gamble. Prior to coming to Columbia as a senior lecturer and serving as faculty director of the Climate Knowledge Initiative, he taught at NYU, Harvard, and Columbia. He was born and raised in Austria, and I am pleased to introduce him. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I realize I'm standing between you and lunch. So I'll keep the graphs to a minimum. And basically, we'll make 3 points. It's bad. What we don't know is worse. And there are massive opportunities. And, well, lunch. Okay, it's bad, right? So, front page news a couple days ago. 52-hour oven has a setting. We make kale chips at 50 degrees centigrade. That was New Delhi 3 days ago, beating the prior temperature record by 3.5 degrees, 3.6 degrees centigrade, right? 10 plus Fahrenheit. And again, I'm not sure what else to do other than shrug my shoulders. Right? So, Kim Stanley Robinson, not as imaginative. If you've read this, chapter 1, 50 degrees in Delhi in 2025. He missed it by a year. Book came out 2 years ago. Right? So, yeah, there is all of this. Right? And amazingly enough, and this is, I promise, so climate economist, I'll keep the science to a minimum, but we are literally good enough at this point. When I say we, right, the global scientific community here, climate scientists, we can look at any old day, the temperature anomaly, right, not sort of the global average and so on, or daily temperatures, and attribute the difference in a particular zip code on that day to climate change. This is today, globally. This is tomorrow, and this is Monday. And the dark red, and yes, we're already running out of colors again. This index was introduced like 4 or 5 years ago, is those temperatures you see, the dark red, 5 times more likely with climate change than without. So, okay, usually, right, so not too long ago, I'm old enough to remember when I had to stand here and basically say things like, well, temperatures, fluctuations, we can't quite yet, and it's been warm before, and hurricanes have happened last century too, and so on. And meanwhile, right, in 3 days, in a particular, New Delhi, for example, attributed back to each ton of CO2. And no, it's not about the stuff we know, it's about the things we don't. Right, so if you remember your economic statistics from way back when, these PDFs, not what Adobe gives us, but probability density functions, right, the extreme end is what's basically increasing exponentially, infinitely. And this graph is from 2007. Right, again, we, Magnamers, sort of climate scientists doing this properly, not us economists then trying to interpret it. But none of this is news. And I assume by you being here, you won't be surprised by this either. But again, it's about this unknown the risks, the tails. By the way, the fact that this, of course, looks too simple, there are lots of things happening here. And it's these extreme temperatures that we've basically never seen before. And yes, this stuff is hitting home. Of course it is. Now, and this is, I promise, the last slide of the sort of depressing portion of the proceedings here. But we've been there before too. Right, so what was it, 2003, when The Economist put the housing bubble on the cover. And basically the story was, look, none of this is surprising. We know now, it took 5 more years for the first 2 Lehman funds to collapse and then the full-on Great Recession to happen as a result. And yeah, had you reacted at the time in 2003, you would have lost more money on the way up than you eventually lost on the way down. Right? And we all saw the movie or read the original screenplay, right? Michael Lewis. Climate is no different. Right? None of this is a surprise. It really isn't. And of course the question is, okay, when, where precisely, and so on. And it's exactly this point, point 1. What we know is bad. And it's what we don't know that's potentially much, 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 much worse. Okay. Theresa introduced me as a climate economist. So here we go. Pop quiz. Anyone know the world's most important number that nobody's ever heard of? Yes, what it should be, right? The social cost of carbon, what it should be. Basically, what each ton of CO2 emitted today costs us, all of us. Now, of course, okay, when I bought a plane, right, and fly back to Austria to see my parents, 1 ton of CO2 emissions back and forth. Not up front, right? Middle seat, economy class. $100, sorry, $200, right there. It's not me paying, it's everybody paying. Right, and yeah, right, sort of your typical US government table to do this sort of thing. And yes, it's not about what we know, it's about the stuff we don't. Or where we're not sure, right? The most likely estimate is somewhere on the left, where you see the peak of this curve. And then there are these risks, the uncertainties, the stuff we just don't know for sure. And of course, it gets even worse, right? Tipping points. Once again, my co-authors would usually kill me when I say what I'm about to say, but the stuff we know, right? The most likely, which is that's the killing part, because tipping points, we don't quite, right? There's lots of uncertainties here. But the most likely impact of these massive negative climatic tipping points, not all that bad, based on these conservative, lowercase conservative calculations. And then we can exclude the tail. Even with the tail risks, right? This is a tail on top of a tail. This is basically the OMG, uncertainty on top of uncertainties. So no, I can't tell you the exact number, but 200 is the bare minimum. How many tons of CO2 are we emitting, each of us? Anyone? Everyone? Per year. Personally. You, personally. So me, average American, per year. That's a lot. That's private jet territory. So average American, 16 tons of CO2. By the way, down from 20. Average European, about 8 to 10. I'm a dual citizen. I get 24. Every one of these tons, right? And, okay, let's do the math, right? 10% of the size of the global economy, 50 billion tons total, so not quite 1,000 per person, but right, the global average times the 8 billion of us, $100 trillion global economy, plus minus a couple trillion, 10% is this externality. And by the way, again, conservative. This paper came out last week. Yeah, hasn't passed peer review yet, so I can't talk about it. Okay, I did promise I would stop with the depressing part, but by the way, this is not unique. Here's another example. Everyone drove here today? I mean, we are north of 60th Street, so we're fine. You're fine. One car, once, into Lower Manhattan. This is not over the lifetime. This is not, right, back and forth for that matter. This is literally one Jerseyite driving in once because they can't figure out the train schedule. $150 per, and this is not, right, endangering my kids scooting on the bike path, none of this, right? There's no health, there's no climate in this, by the way. This is literally just the congestion externality. So yes, this stuff is just, right, it's pervasive, everywhere. Now, okay, this is the point where you kick me out and send me over to CEPR, right? Like, go do your policy thing over there, kiddo. This is the B school, right? Now, what do we do, though, in this context? And yeah, congestion, right? Of the stuff that really hits home. Actually, Bill Vickery, Columbia economist, came up with this like 60 years ago. There's basically only one way to do this, right? You've got to send the right price signal. And no, we're not going to be anywhere near $150 per ride, which, right, you might as well ban vehicles in Lower Manhattan. $450 per ride in. But if you want to park your SUV in Paris these days, it's 250 euros. Yeah, SUV, smaller cars, cheaper. Might as well ban it, right? But of course, it's about, the CEPA stuff, basically. The sort of thing where you say, look, you've got to have the right policies in place, and not just for this. That's 30% of New York's emissions, 70% is buildings. So yes, once again, it's a law, Local Law 97, that will decarbonize this. And yeah, it's insurance, right? It's about the tail of that distribution. It's basically saying, look, at the very least, we've got to internalize what we know, and probably it's gonna be a lot worse, a lot worse. And of course, there's the flip side. See what I did there? Of course, right? That's the flip side. And there too, just to be clear, right? None of this is, okay, there is the sort of the known knowns. Oh, we know what will happen when we pass the Inflation Reduction Act. We don't. We really don't. What we know is that we underestimated the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act when it passed, like 18 months ago. We called it, $300 billion per year-ish. 369 was the very falsely precise estimate at the time. Goldman these days is saying $1.2 trillion. Okay, so cue the right Wall Street Journal editorial page headline, right? Like, once again, they lied to us, of course, right? That's what they do. Underestimate the cost of massive government program, right? The flip side of this is, well, it's a tax credit. Well, mostly it's tax credit, production tax credits, investment tax credits, and so on. Nobody knew. We made educated guesses at the time. And it turns out they're just much more popular than anyone had estimated when it passed. Goldman, too, was somewhere in the hundreds of billions of dollar range. And now they say over $1 trillion in federal subsidies over 10 years, taxpayer money, freeing some, leveraging $3 trillion in private investment over these 10 years. Like $12 trillion overall. One law. Horrible name. Inflation didn't go down. horrible re-election strategy, right? No impact by November in terms of inflation. If anything, it's the other way, right? It's the sort of greenflation bit. OMG, solar panels more expensive, people want them. And no, it's not the right thing to do, right? The economist would say you've got to price the negative externality, get out of the way, and everything will work swimmingly. Recognize this room? So this is the global chair of BCG, Rich Lesser. Actually, here, I think. That's him. Oh, sorry, the other way. There we go, he's sitting here. Okay, first of all, he is the guy, right, who flies around. Yes, his footprint might be 1,000 tons-ish. He's the guy who flies in with the 3-slide presentation to make the sale at the end. And it's a little bit cheating because it's actually hidden under the Zoom bar, so you can't actually read this. But the bottom of his opportunity through going green slide to make the sale on the corporate transformation case. Now, source BCG analysis, semicolon, assumes a $100 per ton global carbon price by 2030. So that too is about policy. Policy as the driver to make something like this happen. And no, the Inflation Reduction Act is not the ideal thing. And we can make fun of, right, government overreach and so on and so forth. But look at the actual impact. Yes, the green stuff is getting cheaper, and implicitly, relative prices is all that matters. The dirty stuff is getting more expensive. By the way, we don't just have BCG over, we also have McKinsey folks here. So Bernd Heit, senior partner, actually this was in my class a couple of weeks ago. So he shows up with his slides too. Right, technology after technology. Solar, wind, the classics, and then hydrogen, sort of the stuff we hadn't heard of until sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago. This is the first slide he shows. Here's the second. He doesn't necessarily pause for dramatic effect because to him, as to everyone else, this sort of thing, of course, is obvious. And see the 100, right? Nice round number. So not just Rich Lesser, not just BCG, McKinsey, and yeah, I can show you the Goldman version of this, or the MS, or any other banks present here. Everyone has their own version of this, quite literally. And it is exactly this combination. And I can tell you, it's uncomfortable. Uncomfortable in the sense of, like, no, none of this is happening automatically. No, none of this is, oh yeah, if you just get out of the way, right? Too much meddling and so on. Or for the matter, like the way we teach basic managerial economics in the core here at the business school, it's growth versus the environment. It is about, we can either let the economy do its thing and look how good we have it around here, or we can, do the SEPA stuff. And there's a reason why we have a nicer building, so, And to be clear, right, none of this is new. So this is the McKinsey version, right? The slides improved slightly over the last 15 or so years. Marginal abatement cost curve. 2009, one of these low bono projects, right? Not quite pro bono, but yeah, Vattenfall paid them, and of course, this is donated to the world. If you look at the left-hand side, squint a little, it says residential lighting. Anyone remember light bulbs? Like the, actual light bulbs? Seen one in this building? They don't exist anymore. What happened? It was George W. Bush who signed a law into place that banned light bulbs. I mean, it was an energy efficiency standard and so on. And by the way, yes, 2007, I'm old enough to remember the Light Bulbs Freedom Act of 2007. Anyone remember Michelle Bachmann? Not sure what she's up to these days, but no, the thing didn't pass, fortunately. By the way, yes, Trump tried to get rid of it again. And GE, Siemens, Philips, and so on basically said, like, no, why? There are better, more efficient products out there. If Walmart no longer stocks the incandescents, what's the point in producing them? Right? Sell a third of all groceries, a third of all light bulbs in this country. So yeah, we took care of some of these. The sort of thing that pays for itself. And no, it didn't go away by itself. Because yes, there are costs to these costless emissions reductions. By the way, proud moment when I tell my kids I'm on the cover of Science, and then they look at the penguins and I'm sorry, it's the thing on the top right. But okay, so this is last November, by the way, fairly recent. More importantly, it's the sort of thing where, of course, we know that there are barriers. And once again, the uncomfortable conclusion, and frankly, I should stop apologizing because I'm the guy who teaches climate policy around here, is no, won't happen by itself. There are barriers to overcome. Remember me making fun of the Jerseyites before? Driving in? Look at transport. Yes, it would pay for itself to figure out what to do about those cars going into Lower Manhattan. Of course it does. All these things pay for themselves many times over. Right? You bike to work, you lead a healthier life, you might see your kids for dinner. Yeah, your apartment might be smaller because you live closer to work. But you live longer, you have a better sex life. I mean, how much more personal does it get? And still, right, we can't figure this out because there are real barriers here. There are. Okay, what do we do? Well, okay, I promised the Goldman marginal abatement cost curve before. Here's them looking at the Inflation Reduction Act. What does it do? It puts many, many more of these technologies in the money. And yes, right now the job is for the rest of us to figure out how to actually make money off deploying those technologies. And that's, frankly, the most blunt statement about the opportunities in all of this. And I'm flattered how many more of you came, so maybe the word traveled quickly, or maybe just another session closed. But here's what we do here at the business school in response to this sort of thing. Right? Because at the end of the day, if we don't tackle, right, if it's just about making fun of the Jerseyites and more bikes and so on, okay, cool, yes, welcome to my YouTube channel. And my failed YouTube channel, according to my kids. But it's the sort of thing where you can figure out how to make these sort of smallish changes that we all know are necessary, of course. What about the real stuff? What about the sort of fundamental technology, right? Some cement here too, but very little. Lots and lots of steel in these new buildings here. 10% of global emissions, global steel sector. Half of that direct. We burn a lot of coal producing steel. Half of it indirect. Takes a lot of energy, power, heat as well. And by the way, the problem is getting worse. It is. Right? We might be recycling a lot of steel. North America and Europe, Japan, Australia. But, well, what about the rest of the world? And that is, of course, where the problem is getting worse. And by the way, this is a 3,500-year-old technology. The chemical equation we use to produce steel has been around 3,000 years longer than the periodic table. And it's literally coal plus iron ore that produces iron and CO2. 2.5 tons of CO2 for every ton of steel. That might be where a couple of your 1,000 tons come from. What do we do? How do we do this? Yeah, we can set a price per ton of CO2. It might make it more expensive. It will make it more expensive to produce it, of course. But if there is no alternative, what do we do? Well, it turns out there's always been an alternative. Use natural gas. Slightly better than coal. Now methane is the problem, more potent greenhouse gas, and I can once again start depressing you. But at the same time, we also know that the real problem is the 70% or so of emissions that come from coal plus iron ore. And it's very hard to see what to do. And I can tell you, you talk to, let's say, the top lobbyist of the World Steel Association, and they will give you 20 ways to cut emissions 5%. And by the way, coal to gas, yeah, cuts emissions. Now here's the problem, right? And it applies to steel as much as for your gas furnace at home. I hope you're not burning coal, but right, from oil to gas, yeah, you can, a more efficient gas furnace. Right? Minus 20%, minus 30, minus 40, and there's a tax credit still around from the 80s, 90s or so that you can get to. But then you're stuck because you can't get below. Now, there are, you see the green, 2 or 3 technologies that actually cut emissions 90%. 90. Deploying them costs more money, of course, otherwise we would be doing it. Deploying them might increase CO2 emissions in the short run. Right? Because you need to put the steel, the cement in the ground. You need to build the new plant. You need to build the solar panel manufacturing facility somewhere, and so on and so forth. So none of this is a direct path. But yes, you can literally look at the natural gas process, swap the gas with hydrogen, ideally green hydrogen, and cut emissions 90%. And of course, it's not that simple. You can just swap one by one, and there's not enough hydrogen, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's sort of a fairly simple step. It comes with additional costs. Doesn't quite work by itself without the additional push. And then there are technologies that, frankly, first time I heard about the fact that you can use electrolysis, chemical electrolysis, to basically take the iron ore, turn it into iron, and do it in a process that is reversible, eminently reversible, because you're basically building a solid-state battery in the process. So when the sun shines or the wind blows, you produce iron, and when the sun doesn't, the wind stops blowing, you're a utility. So suddenly, you're not a steel company anymore. You are entering the utility business as well. You need to change everything. You need to start from scratch. You need to basically not just look at this as, oh yeah, you, right, World Steel Association, industry lobby, right? Yeah, 5%, 10%, a bit of biofuels here, a bit of efficiency there, and so on. That's it. And by the way, efficiency, of course, pays for itself by definition, right? But you've actually got to put new money down. And yes, business school case study, CaseWorks case study, Electra, $85 million in VC funding these days, not yet actually producing anything, but yes, this technology works in theory, can in theory produce steel cheaper than the dirty alternative, but of course it takes a lot more than simply saying, okay, yeah, because of climate, we do this. Now, it's a lot better than the version of saying, well, let's stick with the old and let's just suck the CO2 back in, right? That's possible, but of course, burning coal plus taking the CO2 back out will always be more expensive than just burning coal. So yes, let's do that too, but how about going all the way? How about going to the sort of technologies that, yes, will revolutionize a 3,500-year-old industry? And I can tell you, so we held a workshop here with a dozen or so folks, right? The CEO of Electra, the CTO of the green hydrogen company, and so on. And then, the chief decarbonization officer of the 600-year-old German steel company. And it's pretty uncomfortable for the chief decarbonization officer of the 600-year-old German steel company because, this is a fundamental change, right? This is basically moving from Duisburg to Sweden, for example, where you say, look, the conditions up there are simply better. Lots of cheap, low carbon electricity, relatively speaking. Greenfield development, right? There are always trade-offs, but also real money. 6+ billion euros by now. First plant to be announced to be a literally zero carbon steel plant. Actually, when I had the CEO of that company over in my class, he corrected me and said, low carbon, only minus 97%. So, we've got to be honest here. By the way, this was the view when they announced 2 years ago. Here is it now. The sort of thing that, frankly, unless you look, right? Unless you put on your green lens and basically, or green goggles or whatever it might be, and literally look, right? The sort of thing that doesn't happen automatically, largely because, look, if you're focused on the million tons of steel produced per year right now, the hundreds of millions of tons per steel produced right now, this is all greenfield, more or less. It's large steel companies entering, but basically starting from scratch. And the amazing bit, and this is really where this opportunity is just, well, if it's trillions of dollars of costs, there are trillions of dollars of opportunities here. The amazing bit is you have Mercedes, you have BMW, you have Audi, you have, you name your luxury European car maker, Porsche, standing in line, investing in the steel plant before it's even announced, signing the off-take agreement and so on, and so making it possible in the first place because, yeah, we sort of know where things need to go. And yes, of course, why is all of this happening in Europe? Back to my preaching about policy. Because you actually have not 100, turns out these days it's 75 euros per ton of CO2 carbon price. So no, none of this is, right, us fighting with CEPR, no longer quite as possible now that we've moved 20 blocks north here. None of this is, OMG, they're making our lives more difficult. There is, regulation versus markets. All of this is grasping this with two hands and saying, look, we know which way things need to go. We know we got to stop burning coal in your traditional European steel plant, let's say. I won't finish the sentence while making fun of the Jerseyites once again, but we know that too, right? We know, and basically the short answer with all of this is always to say, look, won't this regulation, New York City building law, decarbonization, yeah, it'll make housing in New York even more expensive. It will. And we can basically come in and say, okay, and therefore this regulation is bad because, look, it's already so expensive and apparently there's 20 million who want to live in New York. Only 8 million can. The rest is forced to move to the burbs, right? And it's the sort of thing where, look, wouldn't it be nice if we could do it all without local law 97? And the short answer, of course, is no. And the proper response, my book at least, is to say, okay, cool. Looks like we need to build more homes in New York. Looks like we need to help the 2,000 or so workers at this particular Austrian steel plant in this case. By the way, the reason why when I woke up in the morning as a kid and it stank outside, yeah, looks like they've turned on the blast furnace again, 50 miles west, upwind. We know there is a better way, a more opportune way. That won't always mean that the one company you think is gonna win is gonna win. That's true. Last time I checked, Xiaomi was a cell phone company. Now they're outperforming Tesla, and the one thing Tesla I thought was good at. Right, so none of this is guaranteed. None of this is, but yes, of course, it can only go one way. And let me stop there and move to Q&A, but there's actually a close colleague of mine here in the econ division, Connor Walsh. You take the most standard macroeconomic model to analyze all of this, Inflation Reduction Act in this case. GDP in this country goes up, of course, right? You spend more money, you get more out, fine. GDP in Europe goes up. Why? Learning by doing. We get better at this stuff. We can't keep that within our borders. So no, this is not growth versus the environment. It's not economy versus anything. It's, of course, green growth versus particular sectors, of course. If I'm invested in coal, my company's on the way out. That's true. And I'll try hard on the lobbying front. Meanwhile, the trillion-dollar business opportunity, of course, is here for the taking. And I will stop there, but happy to tell more stories about the Jerseyites. Renee. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Very interesting remarks. Really appreciate it. Do you see a role for financial regulatory entities around the world who may have no role directly in regulating or subsidizing clean energy or fossil fuels? Do you see a role or a responsibility for them or a possibility for them to have a sort of indirect effect on these kind of outcomes by saying financial institutions have a shift in incentives to lend or serve customers who do green versus fossil type energies? Is that something that you see as effective in achieving these kinds of outcomes? Number one, and relatedly, is that sort of within their appropriate scope of responsibilities is there a way to articulate that it improves the stability of the financial system or the safety of the banking system? Is that an accurate assessment or not?
Um, so there's a lot of nuance here, right? So like SEC regulation to say, yes, disclose your climate risk, absolutely. By the way, I don't have the screenshot of this, but climate conference here, this room, Senator Whitehouse, right, asking more or less directly, actually in an op-ed I wrote with him, actually, for precisely this, carbon disclosure rules, right? Climate risk is financial risk, it is. And yes, therefore, that's a role for the Securities and Exchange Commission. A role that it has taken seriously, proposed, and of course, right, so dialed back those rules dramatically in response to the usual, of course. But yes, now, in many ways, that's a baby step, right? Disclosure, okay, this is like the equivalent of your average New York City apartment building these days needs to have a letter rating next to the door, right? A, B, C, D, F, in terms of energy efficiency. Now, what does that do? Now, yeah, right, presumably, if you're about to pluck down $1 million on your, 750 square feet, you might not want to walk past the D every morning and have to explain to your 6-year-old why a D is okay after all in their class, right? But of course, that's a baby step, right? What you need is for then, much like the New York City building decarbonization regulation, to say, okay, minus 40% by 2030. Because without that, it won't happen, right? Okay, so that's the sort of SEC disclosure, right? Where it gets really difficult is what you mentioned rather directly, right? It's basically guiding investment in a particular direction, right? That's not the role of the regulator, right? This is where even I would say, even I, policy guy, would say, look, this is not, right? The Federal Reserve's job is not to tell Goldman where to put the money. This is, where the NGOs might chain themselves to the building and so on, basically saying, look, they finance coal. But the risk, the financial risk from that coal investment, maybe because of the policy risk, right? Because coal is on its way out. 210 coal plants in this country, and no, we're not adding anymore. It's going down. So yeah, get out sooner rather than later. But again, that's a fine line here. No, it's not the regulator's job to say, thou shalt not invest in this particular asset class. Figure out what the risks are, absolutely.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Could you share your thoughts on the role of the voluntary carbon market?
Interesting day to ask this question. Was it 2 days ago, White House statement? So I mentioned flights before, right? 1 ton of CO2 getting across the Atlantic. You go to united.com or AA or whatever, right? You pay for the flight. They make sure that happens first. And then they give you an option on your $800 ticket to spend $3.50 to offset your emissions. Sorry. No, your flight will not be carbon neutral. And by the way, why do airlines do that voluntarily? Right? They might be pretty bad at lots of things, but selling more tickets, they can manage. So they give you this option because they want to make you feel bad about flying more and doing more of it. So in other words, that aspect of the voluntary carbon market has got to die. And, some of it, once again, right, is basically the state of California suing Delta for falsely claiming that they're the world's first carbon neutral airline. Or the Brits are pretty good at this. At the UK suing British Airways and telling them to cut it out. You cannot claim just because, your most traveled pilot Actually, for Lufthansa, I know this. So the world's the most traveled Lufthansa pilot got to go to like Nicaragua or something to open the tree farm. Now, I'm not against trees in Nicaragua, just to be clear. But when you put a story in your in-flight magazine, how this is going to make you, right? By the way, and of course the box in the in-flight magazine says, and you too can go to Nicaragua now because Lufthansa gets you there, right? Again, sorry, right? That's just not. Now, there's the bigger portion, right? Where you have large corporations basically saying, look, net zero, and the net is doing a lot of work, right? And once again, actually, I'm still standing below the steel plant, right? So if you're a steel plant, and there are these two other technologies out there, like 2.5, right? You can also suck it back out, but two technologies, green hydrogen and electrolysis. But instead, you're still doing coal, and then your chief marketing officer gets $15 million a year to buy enough voluntary carbon offsets for you to be able to put a tree on your annual report? Just stop it. Right? First of all, I mean, again, right? So you're doing this to make yourself look good. I get that, and the SVP for sustainability, right, needs to do something. But please don't. Right? Now, here's the positive version, right? Okay, so given that we don't have a carbon market in this country, and we have one in California, right, thanks to the other Austro-American. He had slightly more steroids in his suitcase when he came over. Like, fantastic, right? By the way, a better system than the European one. We have one here in RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here, doesn't New England states. Amazing. The price isn't high enough, but to have $1 billion a year that then gets spent on subsidizing renewables, amazing, of course. But we don't have a national system. We don't have a carbon price overall. Our effective carbon price in this country is lower than China's when you calculate everything. Right? The usual story, unless we won't, they are, turns out. We are not. So given that lack, if the voluntary carbon market leads to more and eventually gets us there because you have, positive example, Microsoft actually saying we will spend not the $350 on the trees, but the $600, $800, $1,000 per ton of CO2 to climb the learning curve, slide down the cost curve on the real stuff. Sure. Now, there too, right, I would question, look, if there's still a data center with a flat roof that's not plastered in solar panels, start there. But again, right, it's not about the ton abated this year, it's about what comes next. It's about, does this one step, individual step even, lead to more? Does plucking down your credit card for the $350 on United.com motivate you to do more afterwards? Or do you get the warm glow, say, you know, cool, solve climate change for the day. Off to Florida it is. I think we have time for one more question.
So this discussion and many discussions like it are sort of rooted in a sense of inevitability, like this is going to happen because the economics and the overall imperative demand, action. But it sort of neglects the role of politics and backlash to think of it in that way. And we're now seeing, in the course of the election campaign, promises on the part of the Republican Party to reverse, roll back, and essentially try to wreck the progress that the Biden administration has made. I guess what I'm trying to, ask you is, what should the forces of climate action, people that want to see climate action, want to promote climate action, what should we be doing that we're not doing now to change the political conversation so that we are, addressing the legitimate concerns, but also trying to neutralize the the forces of reaction.
Other than moving to Georgia and making your vote count, which I think is still possible, by the way. You had like 2 weeks before you. So decidedly of two minds here. Theresa mentioned, she introduced me, so I write this sort of monthly column. Second to last was about climate after Trump. And I still don't know whether I still believe what I wrote then, but the party line then was that not even Trump can do much of anything these days. Just to be clear, more people will die if he gets elected. They did last time around. Hundreds of Americans died because of increase in local air pollution. And the climate effects, of course, are real too. Yes. But some paragraph in the faculty handbook says I must not talk about politics in the classroom. This counts as one. So let me take the political economy story, which is like, you know, the way we call it, right? We take a step back, we call it political economy, and we're okay to talk about political economy, not politics, of course, ever. When I say not even he can, it is this positive tipping point, right? It's basically, okay, so here you go. IKEA sells a 60 euro over there, I think 75 bucks over here, induction plate, right? So it used to be that the cheapest way to stop poisoning your kids in the kitchen was to basically get one of these, like, you know, electric stoves. And of course, completely inferior, hence the, you know, double wide Viking gas stove. And yes, 15% of childhood asthma due to burning gas in the kitchen, right? We know that. Okay. Used to be that it cost a lot of money. By the way, so I was looking for the slide before because a picture of my kids in our lovely little apartment. We blew $100,000 on decarbonizing that thing 5 years ago. And I boasted about it on, you know, New York Magazine or whatever. Okay, cool. If we did it right now, not because of subsidies, because 5 years later, because stuff got so much cheaper so fast. So we bought, you know, the $5,000 Wi-Fi enabled induction stove. That thing is now $2,500. And again, IKEA sells the 60 euro version of this. IKEA Switzerland sells a product called Solarvarme, made up Swedish name, of course, again. Heat pump. IKEA is selling heat pumps. And solar panels too, by the way. You know, in this case, a trial in IKEA Switzerland. But so, okay, that's this tipping point, right? Or, you know, ever driven an EV? Okay, I don't have a driver's license, never had one. But if you do happen to be the sort of person who enjoys stuck in traffic, yes, there is a thing called an electric vehicle, and it is fundamentally a better technology. And yes, BYD sells an EV SUV for under $10,000. Now, we just slap tariffs on them, because our companies can't figure out how to do any of this stuff, and Tesla gave up on the under $35,000 SUV and so on, and that's SUV, EV. And, you know, we have 3.5-ton tanks clogging up streets in NoHo and Soho. Don't get me started about that, right? But it's this fundamentally better technology that, look, A, if you can afford it, absolutely. You're already going for that. And most importantly, and literally, this, if you take one thing away from all of this, oil, coal, gas, commodities will always fluctuate. Every 10 years, some dude in the Kremlin blows a fuse and gas prices spike 10x overnight. And we've been there before, right? Every 8 to 12 years, predictably, world economic crisis because of geopolitics around oil. By the way, fossilflation. The new clean, mean, lean technologies are technologies. They will get better and cheaper. They can only get better and cheaper. So IKEA's induction plate isn't gonna ever be more than the same. I mean, of course, right, adjusted for inflation and so on, but It'll get better. It'll get cheaper. Solar panels, cheapest source of electricity in history, ever. All in, right? Not the, oh, didn't you think that, sun doesn't shine at night? Yes, even that. And no, what happens in November can't stop that. It will delay things. It will annoy a whole bunch of clean tech VCs. It will do lots and lots of other things. And again, right, the only way we are allowed to talk about it here is we can't talk about the politics. We need to analyze the political economy of things. So, 34-0. That's all I can say. Thank you.